We are ready to go with our next session here, which is Paul Vick, talking about Visual Basic. Where are you going? Where have you been?
Yeah.
Take it away, Paul.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Okay? I can't hear the speakers back here. Okay. It's funny. I see many of the VB team are on the back wall. I think they've come to find out where we're going. So kind of professional hazard, I guess. I'm Paul Vick. I'm an architect on the Visual Basic team, primarily responsible for the language and the compiler. I've worked on Visual Basic since 6.0, sort of through the transition to .NET and beyond, which was a lot of fun. So we're going to talk today I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're going with the language, and the title sort of implies also we're going to talk about the past, but I think I think it was Jim was saying yesterday, probably nobody really here needs much of an introduction to where Visual Basic's been. Everyone's used it probably at some point or another, willingly or unwillingly. But the title kind of actually refers to a quote I'm just going to put up in a second, but actually I just added something random because it came out on the web yesterday, which was somebody pointed out to me that Linus Torvalds actually had a little quote about Visual Basic out there on the web I just thought I would start off with, which was that he believes that, personally, that Visual Basic did more for programming than object-oriented languages did. Although he then did qualify that by saying, and no, Visual Basic is not a great language. So, he sort of gives with one hand and takes away. But, but we do have a kind of long, rich history with the language, and we are sort of trying to chart a sort of very interesting future for it. And so what I'm going to do is I want to start with sort of, when thinking about the past, I want to start with sort of a conjecture. As I look at the features we're doing for VB9, and as I think we think beyond VB9, sort of a realization came to me, and it's probably not a new realization. But really there are only about 10 or 15 good ideas in language design that we just sort of cycle through, and that these good ideas tend to be rediscovered on about a 10 to 15 year cycle. So given that I've been at Microsoft now 14 years, I actually am starting to see some of the ideas that were hot when I joined kind of come back through the wash again, having been discarded for the hot new idea of the moment. But of course, the salient point of it, though, is that every time we rediscover them, we tend to think that this is the first time we've ever actually thought of an idea. I sort of find it very ironic because, of course, I started on Microsoft Access when I joined Microsoft, the database product. And the thing I actually worked on was the query designer. So I spent the first 4 years of my career, working on data language integration, sort of from the other side of it, integrating Visual Basic into a query language. And now I'm spending my time doing it the opposite direction, integrating a query language into Visual Basic. So really, we're just standing on the shoulders of the giants, rediscovering things over and over again. And so specifically, if we look at VB 9.0, there's going to be two things, and two primary things that we are working on. And the first one, which will come as no surprise to anybody, again, I've just been talking about it, and you guys were all here probably yesterday listening to Anders talk in much more detail about it. We're looking at adding structured query extensions to the language. This is the Link project, allowing you to query data, whether it's in relational databases, whether it's in objects, whether it's XML. And then sort of the other part that you may not be as familiar with is we're also looking at extending the language to sort of support data interchange, which in today's world means XML, really. So we're actually looking at ways to be able to produce XML literals directly out of the language, and then also be able to work with XML that you've brought into the language. And this is actually building on a lot of work that Eric Meyer actually did prior to this sort of round of the languages, and he's been working a lot with us about getting that integrated into the language, and he's provided a lot of valuable insights to us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and then we're going to talk also a bit about what may be coming beyond Visual Basic 9.0. So to talk about language integrated query, you all got sort of the overview of the features with Anders the other day, and so I'm just not going to go into them into much detail because I think they're pretty straightforward. We're going to support all the base LINQ features, local type inferencing, object initializers, anonymous types, even Lambda expressions we will be supporting. But I don't really want to talk about these today because I think they're, from a syntactic standpoint, they're syntactically a little different than what you're going to see in C#. But from a semantic perspective, it's not that radically different. And so I don't really kind of want to bore you by going over the same things you've already seen. So instead, what I thought would be interesting to talk about, and hopefully won't bore you guys too much to tears, is some of the interesting issues that we've been dealing with lately as we've been sort of pushing out the frontier of language integrated query and some of the things that we've been encountering out there on the frontiers. So while we think that these sort of low-level features are really interesting from various perspectives, the core sort of aspect of language integrated query for us is the query expressions, because for Visual Basic users especially, they're really data-intensive programmers. They're very familiar with SQL. They're very familiar with the SQL syntax, and so we really believe that where the money payoff in this work is for them is at that sort of high level. And so, we're actually planning on supporting sort of a bit of a richer set of query expressions than even sort of the C# team is currently planning on supporting. So, while we do support, sort of the standard filtering and joining and grouping, we're also working on adding comprehensions for, aggregation, partitioning, some of the set operations, so that you don't have to fall back down to sort of method calls and Lambda expressions for most of the kind of query operations that we're going to support out of the box with the LINQ libraries. And the interesting observation I was just going to make about this is it kind of exposes a little difference between sort of the approaches of the two languages. I mean, sort of, we sit just down the hallway from the C# team, and people sort of accuse us all the time of just being C# without curly braces. But if you look at sort of how we've both approached this feature, it's kind of interesting in that we sort of approached it from either end of the spectrum. So if you look at how C# sort of designed the language integrated query features, they sort of started at the very low level and have kind of worked their way up the spectrum. So they sort of, in fact, if you look, if sort of historically what they started was sort of the method call syntax with Lambda expressions and all this sort of thing. And for a while, actually the C# team didn't even, this was going to be language integrated query. There was no higher level query expression syntax. Whereas for the VB team, of course, these lower level things are very interesting for how we build the plumbing. But for us, what's interesting is the high level syntax. So we sort of start designing from, okay, what do we want the sort of easy syntax to look like? And then we'll sort of work our way down, and then we kind of collide or meet, whatever you want to say, here in the middle with the other teams. And so, some of the issues I'm going to talk about today, some of the interesting things we've been working on, have to do with really taking the view of that this is where a lot of our developers are going to live, and so this query expressions needs to be as simple and as straightforward and as understandable as possible. And this is sort of down here at the lower level, this is a fallback position. We believe that people will write extensions, people will write their own query operations, but that's going to be sort of the more uncommon case than just sort of doing standard querying. So specifically, some of the issues that we've been sort of knocking around these last few weeks or last few months really have to do with sort of the property of the way that the current design is. And if you look at the way that that this sort of high-level query syntax works, you have a very nice, from seeing customers join O and orders on the join condition. But if you look at what this translates down into, what it gets is it's a very simple syntactic transformation. So, we take the customers, we just stick it down here, we call a join method. We take the left join condition, and we use that to generate, we just syntactically push it into a Lambda expression. We take the right side of the join, and we stick it into a lambda expression. And then these are just going to be pushed into the join method, which will then be, you understand how to deal with the lambda expressions. All right. We'll deal with the lambda expressions to do the join and to produce the result of the join. But kind of as I say here, part of the problem with this simple syntactic transformation is, how are we going to get our regular equality semantics? I mean, from the user's perspective, this is just like any expression in the language. There's expression equals expression. But if you look at what this gets translated into, actually it's two separate lambda expressions. And in fact, the type of the equality actually comes from the type inferencing that's going to happen, because join is a generic method, and we're going to infer the type of the equality from the two lambda expressions. Well, what this means then is that essentially now we have to push a lot of our, if we want to have the existing semantics sort of kind of carry through, we have to push the semantics of equality down into type inferencing for our method calls. And what we'd end up having to do is essentially write a whole new sort of adjunct to our spec about how we're going to produce the exact same results for equality. And of course, for VB that's especially difficult because we have some historical quirks in our semantics that we have some non-intuitive results sometimes for types of operations. And so what we would really like to do is, instead of sort of doing this simple syntactic transformation, what we'd really like to have is a more semantic understanding up here of what this operation actually means. But right now, with the way that it's been designed, the way that we've designed it, it's not really possible, because we're just taking one syntax and translating it to another. Now, where this also causes a problem for us is with errors. So what I did was, I'm not actually going to show it because of time, but I wrote a little query that had an error in it, type coercion error. And so let me just show you sort of what the error I got back was. So way over here, I'm sorry it's a little small because I had to make it small so that I could fit the entire error message onto the screen. Here's my little query up here, and I made a little type mismatch error because I'm comparing an integer with a string. But one looks at this and says, where the hell is the actual error in all of this? This junk. What is this? Well, the error is, I don't know if you can see the highlight. Here's actually the error that we're trying to do a conversion from string to double, and because we have strict semantics on in the language, you can't actually do that. But what's happening is, because of, again, we're doing these sort of syntactic conversions, what's happening is we're just pushing this expression down into a lambda, which then gets pushed down into a call to the where method, which then gets compiled. Now what happens then is we go to resolve overloading, which then causes us to try to infer the type of the lambda, which then causes us to try to interpret the lambda expression. And then, of course, we get the failure, but then that cascades outwards. So now the type inference fails, which means the overloading fails. And thus you get sort of, you get the top error, which says that overload resolution failed, and then you get sort of, because we don't know which method you were actually trying to call, and I actually have to agree, overloading can be a bit evil. We're sort of stuck with this, giving you this, horrific error. Now, we could, of course, imagine systems where we try and, understand, push down into overload resolution what we're trying to do, and sort of, modify the semantics down there so that the errors bubble up correctly and suppress the other errors. But really, what we'd like to do is rather than sort of take a view, this kind of low-level view of query, what we'd like to do is take a bit of a higher level view. And so if we step back for a second and look at what it means to make a type queryable, I've sort of written an example VB class here that is queryable. It defines all the underlying query operators: select, many, where, order by, group by, maybe others. The problem right now is that the design of the language integrated query is such that basically the queryable pattern is whatever the syntactic transformation will compile to. So we don't really make any assumptions about what these operators are going to look like or what they really mean, except for what the syntactically is going to be necessary to be able to do the translation. So what we've been thinking about is the fact that actually, though, if you just sort of tighten up the pattern a bit, add a few extra semantic understandings of the pattern, you can actually get a much better result from your query expressions. So all we have to really do is take a look at the pattern and say, if we can just derive the element type out of this, then we can actually solve all the problems we've had so far. And indeed, most queryable operations, if you see here all the ones circled, these are all the element types of the input of the collection. So when I'm performing a select, there's this element type T. That's going to be the type of the input for the select. Or if I'm doing a filter, T is the type of the element that I'm filtering on. And so if I simply require that all these types sort of match up and are consistent, now I can actually start to reason about querying at a much higher level than I was able to before. So in fact, actually, we can solve our problems with this strengthened pattern. So now here, if we go back to our join condition, given that now we can look at customers and actually know what the element type of customers is, we now actually know what the type of C is. We know that C is a customer object. And with orders, we know that the O is of type order. And so now we can flow those types into this expression. And we know, okay, well, this is an integer comparison, and we can do the resolution. And if there were different types, we could sort of implement the existing VB equality semantics. Similarly, with the errors, if we introduce that, this is the query that I got the error on before. If we look now, I'm creating, what I do here is I'm creating an anonymous array of integers, and I'm just filtering them, but here's where I've got my type mismatch error. Well, now I know that this X is of type integer because this is an integer array which flows into here, and the element type of that is integer, which flows into here. And now we can actually evaluate the filter expression before we do the syntactic transformation. So we can actually determine, oh, wait a minute, you've got a type mismatch here, before we have to go into overload resolution, before we have to do any kind of in-type inferencing. So I'll also add, that it's interesting that not only to do this, not only do we have to kind of tighten up the query pattern, we also have to tighten up extension methods a little bit too, because extension methods suffer from some of the same problems that the query translations do as well, in the sense that for extension methods right now, the way they're defined, they're just a simple syntactic transformation. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but to be able to sort of implement this pattern, you actually have to be able to answer the question, given a type, what are its members? It seems like a very simple question that you're going to have to be able to answer, but actually with extension methods as they sort of exist today, that's not actually as easy because extension methods can be generic, because there can be type parameters that the type information can actually flow from arguments back into the type being extended. It can be actually difficult to determine, given a type, what its members are. And so to sort of solve these problems, we also have to tighten up extension methods and limit them slightly to allow you to be able to determine, given a type, what are its members, without actually having an actual call, argument list to be able to interpret with it. So the other sort of interesting, problem that we've been struggling with the query expressions is having to do with sort of a higher level comprehension of grouping and aggregation as well. So, we don't want to actually require people to do explicit to understand the explicit grouping that occurs when you do a group by operation. So, I'm sort of using an example of C#, and I'll apologize. I actually haven't had a chance to verify that this is exactly right syntax, so don't go typing it in and trying it because it may be wrong. But it kind of gives you the idea. But what we have here is, you're having to actually explicitly create and name the group, so that further on down the line, you can sort of explicitly say, okay, well, I want to, for each order that I'm grouping by state, I want to get the key for the state, and then I want to perform a sum across the quantity and the price for each order in that particular group. And Now this isn't this isn't totally unreasonable, but it's not sort of as nice as the way that sort of SQL works and the way we'd like it work, which would be instead of having to state this, just being able to group by the state and then simply understand that, okay, now we have the grouping by introduces a key variable state here. So we can just select it and refer to it by name. We don't have to call it key. And furthermore, I understand that sum is an aggregate. And in the context of an aggregate function, we can bring back into scope the iteration variables that are being grouped. So you don't actually have to refer to the group. You can just talk about the iteration variable O directly. And this sort of looks very SQL-like. To do this, of course, again, it's sort of most of this work requires tightening things up slightly. It will require an explicit understanding of what is an aggregate operator. And for at least the sort of predefined set of operations such as sum and average and count and those sorts of things, we can sort of natively recognize those functions. We are looking at extensions that might allow people to mark aggregate functions so that they can get this special behavior in Visual Basic and be able to take advantage of this semantics. The other thing I'll observe too is that this higher level pushing of semantics up into the query expression enables us to actually optimize queries a bit more than are possible with just a simple syntactic transformation. Right now, I think the focus for the first version of LINQ is really just to get it implemented. But I do believe, coming from a bit of a database background, sort of the next step in all of this is as soon as people get querying, they're going to create large data sets. They're going to try and query over these data sets, and they're going to go, oh my God, this is so slow. What are you doing? And so we want to leave ourselves avenues open for possibilities for being able to optimize queries more highly. And so with this higher level transformation, what we're hoping to be able to do and we're investigating is like whether it would be possible actually to push the aggregate up into the grouping operation itself. Sort of if you look at, if we go back to here, what's going to happen is the group by operation will be performed first, all the groups will be gathered, then you'll perform the aggregation operation on top of those groups. But in the case here, the sum is the only place where the group's actually going to be used. You need the key and you need the sum. And so actually with this only one aggregation, it's not actually going to be necessary to form the groups in this step. If you could just push this aggregation up into the group by operation, you could avoid creating the group. Or if you have multiple aggregate operations, if you're doing a sum and an average, you could actually perform them both at the same time, much as a SQL engine does today. So instead of having to perform it multiple times, work over the group multiple times in the query. All right. So that was just sort of a high-level kind of, some of the things we're working on or thinking about in regards to LINQ and querying. And it hopefully was interesting. Certainly, kind of an interesting set of problems for us to solve. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit, and that we're talking about doing for Visual Basic 9.0, is XML integration. And for this, because I couldn't show a lot of the other stuff I was just talking about because we haven't fully implemented it yet, but for XML we have a nice prototype, and so I just wanted to do a little demo of what it means to integrate XML into the Visual Basic language. So I'm going to switch over here. So I'm just going to do a very actually short, simple demo as part of a larger demo that I've done before, which is that the great advantage, the great thing about using XML is that it's sort of the lingua franca of services on the internet. It's what people consume, it's what people produce, and so what I'd like to do is write a simple little application that's going to take in the Technorati link cosmos for my weblog that tells me about who's been linking to my weblog. I'd like to take that in and then produce an RSS feed out of it. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to call a web service. I'm going to need to get the result back it's in an XML format. It's not actually it's in a not in a, it's not an API. It's just it'll give me back a chunk of XML. So I'm going to need to sort of work with that XML, and then I'm going to need to produce some XML. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here with, I've already created a function, and we'll have to wait for my virtual PC. I have to apologize, my computer's a little underpowered here. So I'm going to call a function that I've already written to go out to the web service, get the link cosmos for me, and in fact, we can sort of see this is the document that's going to be returned. You can see it's sort of the structured XML that has information about my weblog, and then a list of items that are links to my weblog. So so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to start by, we'll start by getting the weblog name out. I mean, I already know that, but let's just get it out anyway. So I'm going to get the document, and I don't actually remember the structure here. It's the TAPI, and it's the document, and result, and weblog and name. Oops. Name. And I'm going to have to put a little bit of CRUD here on the end because of the prototype that I'm working with. So now you see what I'm just doing is I'm just dotting through the document as if it had a strongly typed structure. Now what this is underneath is, if I go here and I sort of hover, what you'll see is that what doc is it's just an Xlink Xlink, which is the new XML DOM that we're producing for link. It's just an X document. So the XML integration is built on top of the standard XML DOM objects that we're going to be producing for link. And so I just get to work with it in a very natural way to get out the value, and I can sort of console.writeLine, my weblog name, and read line so it doesn't go away. And what we'll see here is it'll just print out, it should just print out the name unless I got it wrong somewhere. So there's the name of my weblog. So now what I like to do then is I'd like to get out all the item members. And so what I'm going to do is just write a little query against this, and I'm going to use, so the first thing I'm going to do is actually just get all the items. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to say doc ... item. And what this does is this translates into a call to the descendants member of the document. And so it's just going to, so now items is going to be a collection of all the item members that are children of the document. And so for that we can just see that really quickly by saying, for each item in items, I'm going to write, let's see now, I have to look at the structure here again. Each item has, so the weblog name and the link URL. So item.weblog.name, oops, .value, and then the item.link URL. All right. And now what we'll see if we run this is we'll see, the list of the weblog, that's the name of the weblog that's been linked to me, and then the particular article that they actually linked to. Now, just to talk for a minute, you'll notice that for the identifiers we're actually using the angle brackets here instead of just doing item dot. The reason behind that is actually sort of twofold. One is that we found, well, actually threefold. One is that it does make it nice and sort of lexically distinct as to what you're doing. It also sort of allows you to both access the XML elements of, say, item, but also if you wanted to access the DOM members, the DOM methods of item, you could just say item dot and not use the angle brackets and still have access to the full DOM set of methods. And then the third reason is that this actually allows us to specify XML identifiers that are not legal in Visual Basic. So it creates a sort of a lexically distinct sort of space for us to put XML, and that actually becomes more important in just a moment, actually right now. As I think about, well, now what I want to do with this is, having gotten the information out, what I'd like to do is I'd like to put it into an RSS feed, and I can never, sure, question?
So if you have the XSD, the type
Right.
definition for the XML, do you get line checking?
right, so the question is, if we have an XSD, do you get type checking or IntelliSense? Actually, that would have been really useful as well right here. And the answer for right now is no, but it is something we definitely are investigating. Eric, are we looking at it for IntelliSense? Okay, so for the next version, so we at least want to provide IntelliSense, but probably, right, but type checking won't actually be in this version, but it's something we are definitely really interested in providing, because it's an obvious sort of next step. And actually, I'll touch on it a little bit later in the talk as well. So just quickly here, so now I'm going to put the feed here, and so now I can never actually remember what an RSS feed looks, what the required elements and that kind of thing are. So I'm just going to make it easy on myself. I'm going to I grabbed the XML feed, the RSS feed for my weblog, and I'm just going to drag it in here and see if I get the, and paste it in here. And so now this is just the current feed from today. Now I'll have to stop for a second and say the demo gods are not smiling on me today. You'll notice there's sort of an error here. I won't be able to actually run this because my machine somehow got into a very bad state, and I can't actually get the literals to run. But you'll have to take my word for it. You can download the prototype and type in this code, and it will work. So you can verify for yourself if you doubt me. But there are actually a couple of errors here that I can fix. You notice that there are these namespaces, like I use some namespaces here, www, DC, trackback, and they're not actually defined in my RSS for some reason. And so I'd like to actually put them in. Now I could just put them in as a part of the literal in the normal XML syntax, XMLNS : DC, and give it there. But actually, I'd like to reuse those namespaces in multiple. I might be making other XML literals, and I might want to reuse them. So in fact, what I'm going to do is take the imports and just toss them in at the top of my file here. And so what we've done is, and the syntax will probably change a little bit in the sort of final version of the language, but I'm using the sort of standard namespace importing methodology in Visual Basic to import XML namespaces. And now you'll notice that the error down here is gone because I've defined the DC namespace to be the perl.org.dc elements. Now some of these errors won't go away because, like I said, we haven't. My machine is a little horked at the moment, and I haven't been able to get it to work. So, all right. So now I've got this XML literal here. It's just an XML, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill in the values. So this is Panopticon Central's, link Cosmos, and I'll just leave the link as my weblog for the heck of it. I'm just going to delete it. So now what I'd like to do is I want to create the items that correspond to the item up here, the items that I got from the link Cosmos. And so all I'm really going to have to do is write. I'm going to sort of recast items as a little query, and we say so I can say from item in these items, I'm just going to select a new item tag, and I'm just going to copy the structure from down here. So I'm just going to say, item title is a new link, and then the description is going to be the one I'm going to steal from down here. And close the tag. And now I can close this tag. All right. Now the colorization. Oops, I forgot to close something because it thinks, of course. Haha. My own. So actually what I want to do here is, now the reason why I'm getting kind of weird colorization is, what I wanted to do is put a VB expression in here, but I'm in an XML context. I've actually switched. When I started an XML tag, I've switched now into an XML context, and so it's XML rules here. It's not VB. And so what I need to do is in this description thing, I need to get back out into a VB expression context so that I can use this VB expression to actually calculate the value. And so what we have then is a concept of expression holes, which look a lot like traditional ASP programming, that allows me to sort of punch a hole in the XML and get back out to a VB expression context. And so hopefully this should fix it. And indeed it does. And now I get a spurious error message. So what the colon equals does is it says, okay, I'm transitioning from XML back into VB. And so you can sort of do this an arbitrary number of times. You could have XML in here, and then you could have a sub-expression. But you can sort of go in and out as many times as you want. And so now what I've done is I've created a query that's going to produce a stream of XML elements. And now to finish off my feed, I can just delete all the existing elements here, which I don't need anymore. And I can just say, that after the link in the title, I'm just going to produce, I just want to stick in the value of the result of the items query. So what this does really is it makes it very kind of natural to work with XML in the Visual Basic language. You can produce XML really easily. You can kind of use existing XML formats very easily. You can consume it. It's a very natural way of working with XML. And in fact, just a month or so ago, I was needed to write a little application to translate a Word document into a wiki format that we use internally. And I struggled with the Word document, the Word programming model for a while, and then I suddenly realized, I was like, well, I just convert it to XML, and I slam it into our prototype here, and it was very easy to work with, to just dot through the elements that I could just look at and then produce an XML document back out. So it's a very natural, very, very natural way of working with XML. All right, so let me see, actually. So, sure.
Is there a way of putting XML without putting the XML within the document?
Sorry. Oh, yes. Is the question, can I work with fragments, basically, just elements?
Well, I see myself using XML in an application, no problem. Like I wouldn't want to start hard coding strings of XML in my application.
Right.
Maybe getting it from somewhere or whatever, then concatenating. Usually I'm using a DOM or something to bring the stuff in.
Right.
Now at the moment everything's like right smack into the application, hard coding with it.
Right.
Will there be constructs to help you manipulate something that's much more dynamic?
So the question is it possible to sort of dynamically sort of create XML? For example, you didn't want to hard code the name of the element or something like that, or the structure. Yeah.
This works for like small size applications.
Sure.
Nobody, I don't think anyone would go to an industrial or enterprise level application and start hard coding complete schemas within their application.
Well, I think in terms of hard code, well, yeah, I mean, definitely there's sort of a range of practice in terms of using how XML literals are going to be used. And actually, kind of checking my time, there is definitely a range of practice for how the XML is going to be used. Really? Oh my God. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to take your question offline. I think I misjudged how I am, so I've got a few more things to get through. So I'll have to take your question offline to talk a little more about how you can work dynamically with it. So. All right, so I'm just going to sort of quickly go through this. What I just want to do is emphasize that actually, what I didn't show actually was this format here, which allows you, the @ sign allows you to access XML element, attributes as well as elements. So there's an attribute access, there's an element access, and then there's a descendants access. But what I wanted to emphasize is that what this syntax translates into is just calls to the XML DOM, basically, the new Xlink XML DOM. And similarly with literals, the literals themselves also translate just into, well, not necessarily, here I'm using as an example that they could translate into constructor calls. We may choose to do it in a slightly more efficient series of API calls, but it's essentially a call down into the existing DOM, so you get objects that are usable in any other language. So you can take this literal, pass it to a C# program that has Xlink referenced, and you can work with it as an Xlink object there. So I only got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to go through this a little bit. But sort of now this is what we're going to be doing for the VB9 version. But if you look sort of what the recent history has been, we've spent a lot of time getting ourselves onto .NET, absorbing the .NET features, absorbing the .NET platform, absorbing new features like generics. and now we're sort of integrating the data querying in XML. But the question then sort of comes up, okay, as we look beyond VB9, what are some of the interesting things that we're thinking about? And probably none of this will come as a big surprise to anyone, given actually Jim's talk yesterday kind of stole a bit of my thunder, which is fine, which is great. That's what I knew he was going to do it, and so that was fine. But the two things that we're really interested in right now and investigating is sort of is both bringing a level of interactivity and sort of dynamic feel back into Visual Basic. And this is kind of where we get back to the sort of conjecture I started the talk with, which is sort of this idea of reinventing things every 10 to 15 years. Because if you go back to sort of VB 1.0, which was interpreted and loosely typed, I mean, you actually had a much more interactive, a much more dynamic sort of language than you have today, because we've sort of spent, I could put another 6 bubbles up here. We've spent 9 versions sort of moving towards adding the capabilities to build industrial strength applications and enterprise-wide mission critical applications and all that kind of stuff. And we don't want to move away. We don't want to give up that. We don't want to let go of any of those features. But the reality is that for most people, even us, even the most advanced users, there are a lot of times when we are doing we are programming in styles where highly interactive and highly dynamic features come in and extremely useful, extremely handy. And so it's something that we would really like to see added back more into language. I mean, we have these features in the language. We have edit and continue for interactivity, and we have we support late binding, but it's really important, we think, that to kind of recapture it even more. And so I think I'm going to, rather than go through some of my more slides, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip over to a couple of demos for some things, ideas that we've been prototyping, some ideas that we have. And I'll sort of preface this by saying, these are just investigations, kind of like what Jim was showing yesterday. They're not really tied to a version. They're not tied to anything in particular at this point, besides just being kind of some fun things we've been looking at. So I'd like to show 2 things. The first being sort of looking at when you think about sort of interactivity, the foundation of interactivity is the ability to sort of dynamically evaluate code as you're running in any kind of context. And that really requires a language service that is always available. And it's sort of, for scripting languages, this is like, duh. But for some of the more traditional, some, industrial strength language that we've become, it's kind of, it's been a big step for us. And so what we've been, playing around, for example, is, introducing the VB script concept of eval back into language, what that might look like. And so, so I have a little prototype here of something we've been working on where, much like what Jim was doing yesterday, I can just, sort of eval, so, x equals 5. Actually, let's not even hard code it. Let's just really prove that this isn't made up, although you have to, believe me when I type it in. But, x equals y equals console.readline. Yeah?
So why do you say that the foundation of interactivity is the ability to evaluate code?
Well, not...
Dynamically?
No, actually, it's not dynamically evaluate code, but you need to be able to add new... When I talk about interactivity, what I'm talking about really is being able to modify applications as they're running. And to be able to do that, you have to be able to interpret new pieces of code at the point at which you're entering it. I guess is that...
I don't know. I guess I don't understand what you're getting at, but that's...
Well, I mean, like in other words, like,
the motivation.
Well, like, I think a good example is, sort of the edit and continue feature we have now, which is when you're in the middle of debugging your application, if you run into an error, you can modify the code and fix the error without having to restart the application.
Yeah, but that's different than having an end user or having code that's been deployed do evaluation.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. So what I should emphasize is, like, what I mean is that the service, like what so yes, I'm sorry, kind of in the interest of time, I'm compressing a bit. What I'm really showing here is sort of, an end user facade on a service that may or may not be surfaced to the end user. In other words, what we need a component that will be able to, wherever you may be, wherever you want to provide the interactivity, will be able to take VB code and produce new bytecode, produce new IL, produce something that will execute. But whether or not it's surfaced to the user is sort of a separate issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Somehow it doesn't make sense to me, but I mean that people use, emit and things like that in generating code.
All right.
And a lot of times it's just used for optimization in C#. It has nothing to do with, necessarily, making the app more dynamic. So I'm not sure. I mean, there is a notion of loading code and plugins.
Right. Well, maybe I think maybe there's the terminology also. Is like when I'm talking about interactivity, I'm talking more in terms of development experience rather than actually when it's sort of an end user interacting with an application may or may not. It's not so much about necessarily the interactivity of the end user interacting with your application as much as it is the developer interacting with building their application.
Yeah, well,
But anyway,
totally
okay,
tell you,
all right,
point.
yeah,
I
okay,
don't see the motivation.
okay, yeah. So anyway, so what we're going to do here is I'm just going to quickly, do a message box.show, and we'll just x plus y. So we'll calculate the result of adding the two variables together. And so now I'm just going to run this. And what we're going to do is we built sort of a prototype language service that can sort of be run outside of the context of Visual Studio. So I can, enter 10, I can enter 20 here, and now it's yep. And we, of course, cause an exception. Well, the demo gods are not with me today. All right, well, yeah, that's true. I haven't, all right, message box.show x plus y. No idea what I've done wrong here, so I'm just going to have to, move on to the other one. Maybe this will give a better idea of exactly what I'm talking about.
But could you enter any expression there in eval? I mean, it seems like it would be a gigantic security hole. I mean,
right. Well, what this is built on top of, is actually the reflection architecture. So in a sense, like, evaluation is built on the fundamental security model of the CLR. So to be able to compile code, to be able to evaluate code, you have to actually have permission to be able to do so using the code access security in the CLR itself. And so if you're running in a sandbox, where you don't actually have permission to do reflection emit or to do IL generation, then
I just get the feeling that whenever somebody gets access to that, they're going to turn that on because the value is useful to them, and somebody's going to stick a string there that it's going to lead to the same thing we've seen: SQL injection and cluster-side scripting.
Right. Yeah. Right. So eval is definitely eval is exactly what we're talking about with SQL. It's a dangerous. It's something that has to be used very carefully. Maybe actually a better example. So what we've been doing is taking services like this and then building on top of that. So what I'm showing here is a prototype sort of environment. What we'd like to do, what we're sort of doing as a playground for ideas as to how we might make the Visual Basic programming experience quite a bit more interactive and sort of easier to use in a sense. So you'll notice that it's actually much more stripped down. It's not Visual Studio for the moment with 500 windows. And actually, I don't have my, oh dear. Here, let's see if I can do this. Well, hopefully it's big enough. Actually, we're pretty close. So what I have here is actually a Visual Basic script that I actually copied from one of the web VBScript repositories. So this is actually an old style VBScript. It creates Excel, does a WMI query, I believe, and then gets a bunch of values about the services running. And you'll notice that first of all, it's a bit of a simpler language. You don't have to create, no submain is required, no module, no class, no nothing. I can just run it. And so I can just actually run this, very simple script, and I'm just praying that, that this will actually work today, since I seem to be just, here we go. All right, well, so they haven't totally killed me. So now we see that, we just create a little Excel spreadsheet with the services running on this box. Now, but actually we can take this a little further. Instead of just writing to Excel, I can actually do sort of the demo that Jim loves to do, except that I'm not really tempting fate by trying to use WPF, Avalon, whatever, WPF. I'm going to use standard WinForms, and what I'm going to do here is just take little bit of VB code that would create a form and show it. And I'm just going to hit Control E, and what that's going to do is it's just going to dynamically evaluate this code. Now it's still a little prototypey. So now I've got this live form here. What I'm going to want to do is I guess I want to add a button to it. So I'm going to create the button. Now I've created the button, but I haven't actually added it to the form. So let's go ahead and do that. And so now it shows up, but I don't particularly like the color. So why don't we go ahead and do the color? But actually, that's a little too dark. Nobody can see what it says anymore. So I guess what I want to do is change the color here. And all right. And what you see here is actually in sort of this prototype, not only am I sort of dynamically able to, evaluate expressions and have them work in my live application, but we're flowing the type information through here so that I actually have a little bit of IntelliSense here as well, that I know that this, here are all the members of color. And so I think I'm going to choose chartreuse. I don't know what color chartreuse is, and so that just sounds interesting. And so I'm going to select that, and oh, okay, it's a green color. That's kind of interesting. And so now I'd like my button to do something. So one thing we don't sort of have hooked up in this prototype is declarative event handling. So I'm going to have to kind of do this by hand. So the first thing I'm going to do is define this method here to handle the click, and it's just going to put up a message box. And now, but you'll see actually that the button isn't actually hooked up yet. Nothing's happening. So let's actually use an imperative event hookup here. And now, now my button actually works. So this is just sort of, some of a playground we've kind of been doing to try out some ideas for how it might be possible to work with your Visual Basic code in the future to be able to add a much more scripting-like feel back to the language for the scenarios where you're not doing necessarily, you're not in Visual Studio Team System having invested however, tens of thousands of dollars in, tools and, building industrial applications. If you're doing a more scripting-like scenario, you'll be able to do this very interactive development and debugging. So I think, how much time do I have? Where am I at here? I'm in the wrap-up page. Well, excellent. Okay, well, you rushed me along for nothing. All right, well, let's just skip over here. I'll wrap it up, and then we can have questions. You guys can. So anyway, that's kind of an overview of kind of what we've been thinking about for Visual Basic 9, and then a little bit of thinking about beyond. The Visual Basic 9 preview stuff, the XML literal stuff that I demoed, as well as the link. We have some preview bits that are available online if you want to look at them. And then I also have a weblog if you want to read more about what we've been doing, although I haven't actually been posting that much in the last couple of weeks due to preparing for this and other things. And so I think that's pretty much actually it. This is a good place to stop, actually. So if there are any other questions, I'm happy to take questions.
So why the kind of obsession with the angle brackets in the XML? Why not just go against the info set, and then you can build arbitrary serializers and even create object models? So any chance you can get rid of the little angle brackets and stuff and typing all that stuff? It's kind of nasty.
So is the question, actually I'm going to make sure, so is the question about the angle brackets specifically, or about actually creating objects, real objects directly?
Specifically, then downstream, because you're really just creating a bunch of objects anyways, right?
Right.
That syntax.
Right. Well, like I said, I think that originally when we started with it, we actually didn't use. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, the first question was why angle brackets? Why bother with angle brackets? Originally actually we didn't use angle brackets. We just used the dot syntax. But as I kind of talked about a little bit in the presentation, there's some sort of lexical issues in terms of valid names in VB and valid names in XML that we ran into that actually the angle brackets helps a lot with. It sort of identifies the fact that you're transitioning into XML naming.
Could you just escape the whole thing in some thing?
Yeah, you mean in terms of, Well, but the
quote the whole thing somehow.
Right. Well, in a sense, the angle brackets are a quote. You're sort of saying, well, why not quote it at a higher level? And I think that what it tends to happen, well, for member access, I think more often than not, you're usually not doing more than you would be just quoting one or two member accesses anyway. And so at that point, you pretty much, the angle brackets function pretty much as the quoting mechanism. You're not gonna have a larger quoting mechanism. And for XML literals, actually, I guess it's pretty much, they're pretty distinct anyway. So I don't know if that answers your question, though. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, that quoting them, but also making them, what's the word? I might be able to make them variable, not variable, but parameterable.
Sorry, say that again?
Create a parameter with those values, because you used to they take a node, test it for a string value, continue. So your string value could have been picked up from like a file on disk or anywhere in the database, but now it's right smack in there and you can't get it out. So be able to say, well, I want to replace that with this now instead.
I'm not sure I actually exactly.
The structure that you're offering is nice and elegant and simple to use, but you're locking in with defined identifiers, defined tags.
Right. Well, actually, you what?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to use a variable, you can still use the other syntax, which is what you're generating,
Right.
get element or whatever it is.
Right, and also I believe, actually Eric will have to, I believe also that you can actually use expression holes for the names of the tags as well. So, yeah, so, right. Right. So, yeah, so to kind of repeat that for everyone, that that the expression holes that I showed don't actually just have to be for values, but they can actually be for any piece of the syntax. So the element names, attribute names can also be expression holes, and so can be dynamically specified in your application.
Because that's nice because you get that nice clean syntax.
Right.
So it's
Right. So you get the exactly, you get the syntax, but you get the flexibility. You're not tying yourself to a particular name.
That brings up the question whether you escape the holes, the VB holes, whether you do automatic XML skipping of characters.
Sorry, say that again?
You said that you can put these VB holes
Right.
in the XML anywhere.
Right.
That brings up, do you do automatic escaping of characters in the XML?
And you mean?
If it evaluates to the less than character.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So the string, so the VB string has a less than, and we're now specifying it as the as something in XML, or is the escaping going to happen automatically? And actually, I think the answer is no to that, but I think you'll have to do that yourself. Unfortunately, yeah. Sure.
Got a question about interoperability.
Sure.
A lot of developers in the previous versions of VB depended upon VB to do a lot of calls and DLLs, COM objects that they've created in-house. Are the future versions going to continue to provide that same level of interoperability?
You mean in terms of with COM objects and?
Not just COM, but just functions and DLLs. I mean, just, I guess, unmanaged code.
Right, yeah. So actually, so the existing level of interoperability, question was whether we'll continue to support interoperability with unmanaged code at the level we have in the past. And the answer is yes, we will. So what works in the last 3 versions, the interop will still be available. And in fact, actually, we've been doing some work recently looking at releasing even more help for being able to work with COM objects and make the interop process even easier. So in fact, it's our goal in the future as we move forward is to continue to make it easier, because we recognize, I mean, there's a lot of COM stuff, and that is not going anywhere. And so, anything we can do to make it easier to work with that is going to be a benefit. So, I'm seeing 2 more questions. Do we have 2 more questions? Anybody? Okay. Well, thanks very much.